For 10,000 years, humanity cowered in the dark, entirely at the absolute mercy of the elements. We hid in caves from the freezing winds, we prayed to the unforgiving skies for rain, and we bowed in terror before the unpredictable wrath of nature. But then, a profound and deeply arrogant shift occurred in the human psyche, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. We dug deep into the earth, ripped out its ancient fossilized heart, and set it ablaze. We looked at the ancient, terrifying chaos of the natural world, and we confidently answered it with iron, fire, and deafening steam. We believed that by erecting massive cities of brick and concrete, we had built an impenetrable fortress against the elements. We believed that we had fundamentally conquered the planet, that the sky itself was merely a boundless, empty canvas for our soaring, triumphant smokestacks. But nature does not surrender. It does not negotiate. It only observes, keeping a silent, meticulous ledger of our trespasses. It waits patiently for our hubris to reach its absolute breaking point. And occasionally, nature takes the very machines of our so-called progress and violently twists them into a flawless, inescapable weapon of mass execution. The year was 1952. The place was London. This was not just a city. It was the beating, mechanical heart of the British Empire. It was a sprawling, roaring, unyielding metropolis fueled almost entirely by the endless, ravenous burning of coal. The city was still carrying the deep, jagged scars of the Second World War. Bombed-out buildings still stood as silent monuments to the Blitz. But the spirit of the Londoners was unbroken. They were tough, resilient, and accustomed to hardship. For generations, the citizens of this massive industrial hub had romanticized the smoke that constantly hung over their streets. The thick, gray fog rolling off the dark waters of the River Thames was viewed as a symbol of their economic might, a testament to their tireless, roaring factories. They affectionately called it the pea souper, a familiar, almost comforting blanket that draped heavily over the wet cobblestones, the glowing gas lamps, and the Gothic architecture. But in the bitter, freezing December of 1952, this familiar, quiet companion would violently mutate into a suffocating, apocalyptic monster. The winter that year arrived with an unnatural, punishing brutality. A freezing, biting chill seized the British capital with an iron grip, plummeting temperatures far below the seasonal average. To combat the bone-deep cold, millions of ordinary Londoners did exactly what they had always done. They piled coal into their small domestic fireplaces, desperate to keep the biting winter chill out of their cramped, freezing, drafty homes. But post-war Britain was economically crippled. The government was desperately trying to rebuild a shattered nation. To pay off crippling international debts, the highest quality, clean-burning, hard coal was aggressively exported to foreign markets. What was left behind for the ordinary citizens of London was a cheap, highly toxic, heavily sulfurous variant of coal, colloquially known as nutty slack. It was a filthy, crumbly fuel that burned poorly and smoked heavily. As millions of domestic fires burned this toxic, cheap fuel to survive the freeze, millions of brick chimneys violently vomited thick, black, sulfur-laced smoke directly into the winter sky. Simultaneously, the city's massive, roaring electrical power plants, Battersea, Bankside, Fulham, and Kingston, were running at absolute maximum capacity to keep the city illuminated and warm. Their colossal, towering industrial smokestacks pumped thousands of tons of deadly sulfur dioxide, hydrochloric acid, and dark particulate matter into the atmosphere every single hour. The city was exhaling pure poison on an unprecedented industrial scale. In any normal winter, the cold, brisk winds sweeping off the Atlantic Ocean would eventually carry this industrial toxic waste away, diluting it harmlessly across the vast European continent. But on the early morning of Friday, December 5th, 1952, the wind simply died. Absolute terrifying atmospheric stillness descended upon the sprawling city. Nature had quietly, effortlessly initiated its trap. A massive meteorological phenomenon known as an anticyclone, a highly stable, high-pressure weather system, settled directly over the Thames Valley. This system acted exactly like a colossal, invisible glass lid placed firmly over a burning, smoking jar. A deadly atmospheric inversion occurred. A layer of relatively warm air was trapped high above, pressing heavily and aggressively down upon the freezing, stagnant air at street level. The millions of tons of black smoke, toxic sulfur, and industrial exhaust violently pouring out of London's chimneys had absolutely nowhere to go. It hit the invisible atmospheric ceiling, cooled rapidly, and fell aggressively back down onto the streets, trapping the city inside its own exhaust pipe. By midday on December 5th, the sky over London did not just turn gray. It turned a sickly, unnatural, terrifying shade of yellowish black, a color that seemed to absorb the very light of the sun. The Great Smog had begun. This was no longer fog. The moisture in the freezing air had fundamentally chemically reacted with the thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide emitted by the cheap coal. It created a dense, highly acidic, chemical ocean suspended in the air. The citizens of London were suddenly completely submerged in a lingering mist of highly concentrated sulfuric acid. Imagine for a moment the primal sensation of claustrophobia. We typically associate that terrifying feeling with being physically trapped in a locked closet, buried alive in a coffin, or trapped in a sinking submarine. But in December 1952, the citizens of London experienced the purest, most agonizing form of claustrophobia in the middle of wide-open public streets. It was open-air suffocation. The smog became so unimaginably thick, so heavily saturated with toxic soot, that visibility dropped from meters to feet to absolute zero. It was widely reported that people walking down the street could not even see their own shoes beneath them. A suffocating, pitch-black night descended upon the city in the middle of the afternoon. The street lamps, usually a beacon of safety, were rendered completely useless, their light swallowed within inches by the swirling yellow-black mass. The vibrant, roaring, unstoppable metropolis of London was completely, utterly paralyzed by its own toxic breath. Transportation ceased to exist. Cars were simply abandoned in the middle of the roads, left with their doors open, as drivers realized the absolute impossibility and terror of navigating the blinding darkness. The iconic red double-decker buses sat empty, dark, and silent, their massive engines dead, looking like stranded leviathans swallowed by the thick yellow gloom. The sprawling, intricate, above-ground network of trains came to a grinding, screeching halt, terrified of blind collisions. Even the massive merchant boats and ferries on the River Thames were blindly anchored, their captains refusing to move an inch in the chemical void. Pedestrians attempting to walk the mere 2 or 3 blocks to their homes found themselves entirely hopelessly lost in neighborhoods they had lived in their entire lives. Direction ceased to exist. Familiar landmarks were erased. The city they knew intimately became an infinite, dark, toxic labyrinth designed to disorient and consume them. The terror of walking blindly through this acid cloud was deeply amplified by a haunting, unnatural silence. The smog was so dense, so heavy with particulates, that it acted as a massive acoustic sponge. It absorbed and choked the sounds of the bustling city. There were no roaring engines, no shouting crowds, no ringing bells, just the muffled, terrifying, rhythmic sound of millions of unseen people coughing violently in the dark. The streets themselves became deadly, invisible traps. Police received horrifying reports of ordinary citizens, completely blinded by the smog, walking straight off the unprotected edges of the docks. Unable to see the dark water below, unable to tell up from down, they plunged heavily into the freezing black currents of the River Thames. Their desperate, frantic screams for help were entirely swallowed by the thick yellow fog. They drowned quietly, freezing and choking, just meters away from unseen bystanders who could not even find the edge of the water to throw a rope. But the true, apocalyptic horror of the Great Smog was not merely the loss of sight or the terrifying disorientation. It was the loss of air. With every single breath, Londoners were pulling thousands of toxic, jagged microparticles, heavy soot, and concentrated sulfuric acid directly into their fragile, unprotected lungs. The human respiratory system, evolved over millions of years to breathe the clean air of the earth, was violently, chemically overwhelmed in a matter of seconds. Small birds, navigating blindly in the toxic canopy, were poisoned mid-flight. They simply dropped dead out of the sky, their tiny, lifeless bodies littering the soot-covered pavements like dark, biblical omens. Prize-winning cattle at the famous Smithfield show, housed in supposedly safe agricultural pens, choked to death in agonizing slow motion. Their massive lungs chemically burned from the inside out. But humanity, the proud architect of this nightmare, was the ultimate victim of its own industrial creation. The smog was so fine, so invasive, that it did not respect the boundary between the outdoors and the indoors. It did not stay in the streets. It relentlessly seeped under heavy wooden doors, crawled through keyholes, and poured silently through the microscopic cracks of closed, locked windows. There was absolutely no sanctuary. The toxic ocean aggressively invaded the supposed sacred safety of the home. Theaters and cinemas were forced to shut down entirely in the middle of screenings. The smog had violently filled the massive auditoriums, becoming so incredibly thick that audiences, sitting in the back rows, could not even see the glowing white screen in front of them. The projector beams became solid, impenetrable cones of swirling yellow-black dust. Inside the city's hospitals, a scene of pure, unadulterated medical horror was rapidly, chaotically unfolding. The wards were overwhelmed by a massive sudden tidal wave of the sick, the vulnerable, the elderly, and the very young. People were staggering through the hospital doors in a state of sheer panic, their lips turning a terrifying, sickly shade of cyan blue from severe oxygen deprivation. They were violently gasping for air, their chests heaving, essentially drowning on dry land. But the hospitals were utterly helpless against the sheer volume of the dying. The medical staff watched in absolute paralyzing horror as their limited supplies of supplemental oxygen vanished in mere hours. Ambulances could not answer the desperate continuous ringing of the emergency lines. The drivers could not see the roads. In a desperate attempt to save lives, paramedics attempted to walk in front of the ambulances with handheld red emergency flares to guide the vehicles. But the smog was so absolute that it swallowed the bright red light of the flares within mere inches. The rescue network collapsed completely. Thousands of people, trapped in their freezing dark homes, cut off from all medical aid, were left entirely to their tragic fate. They lay in their beds, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, suffocating slowly and silently on the poison their own city had proudly manufactured. The elderly, already weakened by the bitter cold, found their lungs rapidly filling with a deadly mixture of fluid and heavy soot. Their breathing turned into a desperate, hollow, terrifying death rattle that echoed through the quiet, smog-filled rooms. The death toll rose so rapidly that the city's infrastructure of death completely fractured. Undertakers and coffin makers ran out of wood. The dead were piling up in the morgues, and the homes faster than the coffins could possibly be built. Floral deliveries for funerals ceased, not just because of the traffic, but because the acid in the air had instantly killed all the flowers in the city's greenhouses. For 5 agonizing, endless, pitch-black days, the great city of London was a suffocating, apocalyptic tomb. The greatest empire on earth had been brought entirely to its knees, not by a foreign army, not by a nuclear strike from a superpower rival, but by the very air it had arrogantly polluted in the name of progress. And then, as mysteriously and quietly as it had arrived, the invisible atmospheric lid finally lifted. On December 9th, the weather broke. A brisk, strong western wind swept aggressively through the Thames Valley, violently pushing the yellow toxic cloud out of the city and dissipating it into the North Sea. The sun finally broke through the terrible gloom, casting a harsh, revealing light on a city fundamentally changed. The pristine buildings, the statues, and the streets were heavily stained black with thick, greasy soot, mirroring the profound, silent grief of the population. But the true, horrifying scale of the devastation was heavily, deliberately suppressed by the pride of the British government. Winston Churchill's administration, fearful of public panic and desperate to protect the coal industry, initiated a massive campaign of denial. The initial official reports callously claimed that only 4,000 people had died, strongly suggesting that an unseasonable, virulent influenza epidemic was entirely to blame for the overflowing morgues. They refused to admit that the roaring engine of their economy was also the flawless engine of their destruction. They blamed a virus rather than their own arrogance. It wasn't until decades later, through rigorous modern scientific and epidemiological analysis, that the horrific, undeniable truth of the Great Smog was finally uncovered. The Great Smog did not kill 4,000 people. That was a comfortable political lie. In those 5 suffocating days and the agonizing, painful weeks that immediately followed, more than 12,000 human beings were choked to death by the toxic air. Over 100,000 more were left with permanent, crippling respiratory illnesses, their fragile lungs forever scarred and blackened by the yellow fog. The Great Smog of 1952 remains the deadliest environmental disaster in the entire recorded history of the United Kingdom. It stands today as a terrifying, permanent, unyielding monument to the absolute limits of human control over the natural world. We build our towering steel factories, We dig deep to burn the ancient earth, and we wrap ourselves in the comforting delusion that we are immune to the consequences of our unrelenting progress. But nature is an unyielding, meticulous accountant. It does not forgive and it does not forget. It always, eventually, violently balances the scales. The 12,000 souls who died gasping in the pitch-black silent rooms of London did not fall to an unpredictable natural disaster. They fell to the ultimate, inevitable consequence of human hubris. We look back into the dense, suffocating yellow fog of the past, hoping desperately that it is just a dark nightmare safely confined to the pages of history books. But history is not dead. It is not gone. It only waits patiently, heavily in the shadows, to be remembered.